So here we have our Laura, and I'm going to take a minute to chat about top stitching. For a garment like the Laura with simple lines and beautiful construction, it lends itself as a perfect stage to top stitching. So I have a patterned fabric here, and so now I have a choice if I want to use a plain red thread, which would be contrasting, or if I could use a thicker thread, which is more of a top stitching weight thread. So I'm going to take a minute to chat with you about the various options that we have. First of all, let's talk about weight of the fabric. So if we have a lighter weight fabric, so this fabric that I have over here is very lightweight cotton, and I would not want to use a heavier thread on it. It would create puckers as I sew, and it would just look a little bit out of place. So I think I'm going to go with this lighter, thinner thread that I have over here. So I have got a swatch of denim fabric here. If you were using a heavier weight fabric, example denim or corduroy, or something with a little bit more weight for your Laura dress, you might be able to use a thicker thread for your top stitching. It would give a lovely detail. So what kinds of needles would you use for top stitching? I have three options over here. Top stitch needle. You could use your regular needle that you'd use for any kind of cotton. So that's what I use for quilting cotton typically. And you could also use your twin needle. So this is a stretch twin needle. You would use a woven twin needle for top stitching your woven fabrics. I want to show you just real quickly the difference between a regular needle that I use for quilting cotton and a needle that I would use for top stitching. So before pointing this out, I want to show you just take a look at the thickness of the thread between a regular all-purpose thread that we'd use for just about anything versus this thicker thread that I would use for top stitching. I dare say that the thread is about 2 if not 3 times thicker, has a much greater diameter than the all-purpose thread, and as such a top stitching needle has much bigger of an eye. The needle on the top is a regular needle, that all-purpose needle that I use for just about anything, and the needle on the bottom, if you notice, it's got a much bigger eye, and that's to accommodate the thicker thread that we would use for top stitching. So if you were using denim or a heavier weight fabric, go ahead and use that bottom needle if you can get your hands on it. Otherwise, we're going to be going ahead with using that top needle for top stitching the details in this Laura. So as we talked about it, some of the factors that determine how well your top stitching turns out is the type of fabric that you're using, the type of needles that you choose, what types of threads you choose. But apart from that, you should also consider the tension that you have on your sewing machine. So always grab a swatch of scrap fabric, excuse me, always grab a swatch of scrap fabric. That's a tongue twister. Scrap fabric, and just play around with the stitches before stitching into your actual garment. So you'd want to play around with the tension settings. Another thing you need to consider is stitch length. So for top stitching, I prefer to use a slightly larger stitch length. On my machine, it would be a size 4 stitch length. I use a size 3 for regular stitches. For top stitching, I use a 4 or a 4.5 depending on the garment. So for For fabrics, for garments that are made with finer fabrics, you could get away with using a slightly shorter stitch length, but for garments which have heavier fabric like denim, you want to use larger stitch length. In particular, if you are sewing with a contrast top stitching thread. Now, contrast top stitching is something that scares me even to this day. I always hold my breath when I'm sewing with contrasting thread for top stitching. It is a skill I have yet to master, so definitely takes a lot of practice, but I would be so thrilled to see your top stitching. Just show it in the group. I'm sure everybody will be so pleased to take a look at how wonderfully you've done. Also look out for our blog post on the Rebecca Page blog for tips on top stitching, which will be in conjunction with our Laura Sewalong, because the Laura is such a beautiful garment to showcase your beautiful top stitching on. So I'm gonna go ahead and make some decisions about what kind of thread I want to use, which of these needles I feel I need to fix into my machine right now, and then I'm going to go ahead and top stitch this. Remember, top stitch it in the same side, on the same side, excuse me, on the same side as I have ironed my seam allowance towards. So on mine, I have ironed it towards the left hand side, right over here. So I'm going to be top stitching on the left hand side. So also you could just go ahead and do this with a twin needle. That is fine. I'm going to be using a single needle, so I've got a decision to make now. Red or white top stitching needle, or regular sewing needle. Okay, back at the sewing machine again. I have succumbed to the pressure of the scrutiny of the camera, and just decided to go with navy blue thread so that any of my flaws can be hidden. Okay, but one thing that I forgot to mention earlier is if you are using top stitch weight thread, the thread in your bobbin is regular all-purpose thread, so you don't use top stitching thread in your bobbin as well. Only the top thread that goes through your needle will be top stitching thread. The thread in your bobbin will be regular thread. So I'm going to go ahead and top stitch this with a longer stitch length, with just a little bit short of a quarter of an inch, just so I catch that seam allowance below, and do this all throughout the length of this center back seam. So go ahead and do that now. Oh, one more thing. Because a top stitch is not a construction stitch, it is not entirely necessary to backstitch at the front and the end. I do it out of habit, but if you choose not to, that is fine. Seeing as the top and the end will get caught in the seam allowances for the neckband in our later step, and in the hemming for the bottom of the garment. Another thing about top stitching is it's one of those things that you want to absolutely take your time. I find that when I rush through top stitching, my seams get a little bit jagged. So take your time, and some of the best top stitching I have ever done is on the Rebecca Page Kingston jacket. Loads of top stitching on that garment, and I took an entire evening on the top stitching details, but it's so worth the effort because I did it in a contrasting thread on denim, and it just turned out beautifully. So take your time, stitch slowly, grab a coffee or a beverage of your choice, and go through this step slowly. Right, here we go. Not too shabby. So here's the top stitching done on the center back seam. Now remember, if top stitching gives you the jitters, that's perfectly fine. You can go ahead and skip this step. It's not necessary to the construction of the garment. It's merely cosmetic. Here's what the top stitched seam will look like on the back of the garment. So as you can see, the seam allowance is nice and anchored back, so it will not be flapping around when you wear your garment. So if you would like, you can go and give this another press, before we set it aside to do the the shoulder seams, excuse me. We are getting started with the shoulder seams now. I have my Laura dress back and front laying right sides together. Now if you're sewing your Laura in knit, you want to just go ahead and line up the shoulder seams and serge both shoulder seams in at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. If you will not be doing French seams and this is a woven Laura you're sewing, go ahead and sew this in with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and then you can finish your seam, you can finish the raw edges, excuse me, in your preferred method. So you could either bind this with some bias binding, or you could go ahead and zigzag stitch this in, or even serge it in. For the purpose of this tutorial, we will be sewing the shoulder seams in by French seams. Here we go. Now off to our machine where we'll be sewing this with a 1/4 inch seam allowance on both shoulders. I want to take a moment to point this out real quick. We've sewn this in with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and if you notice, there is a little bit of excess seam. Let me just get a good zoom on that. Here we go. There, just a little bit. Now, the reason this is because we have two curves that are intersecting. So if you look at it from the right side of the garment, you have this curve and then you have this curve. So basically, once we sew this and we turn it the other way around, the raw edges will align up at the 1/2 inch seam line. So do not worry that your raw edges aren't matching up. They're not meant to match up because these are two curves that are intersecting. They will match up at the seam line, but not at the raw edges. Here we have the left shoulder of our Laura. So I'm just gonna snip off that tiny bit of thread. And just as we did previously, we're just going to trim off half the seam allowance. If you don't want to take half off, that is perfectly fine. Just take off a little bit, or just any stray threads that you can see. So just as we did before, what we're going to do is open your garment up at the shoulders. Now this is a curve, so you want to iron it as a curve. If you're sewing one of the smaller sizes and you want to use your tailor's hem, this would be a good thing to use at this point of time. Otherwise, just take caution. This is a curve, so iron it as such. Iron your seam to one side and then turn it over to the wrong side once you've got that sharp crease of the seam, and just iron it flat this way, and we'll be back to sew the rest of the front seam. Here we have it, back from the ironing board, and now we have our Laura front and back with right sides together, pinned at the shoulder seams, and ready for us to head to the machine and sew this in with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So we're just going to do that real quick on the left shoulder seam and the right shoulder seam. Now that we're done with our front seam, let's go ahead to the ironing board, and I'm going to iron this towards the back of the garment, and then I'm going to top stitch the seams in. Top stitching is optional. First to the ironing board. Well, here we have it, important life lesson. Before you start to top stitch, check your bobbin thread. I learned that for roll hems the hard way, but here we have it for top stitching as well. It applies. Check your bobbin thread. Check that you've got thread in your bobbin before you start to top stitch, because here I am 3 inches into my seam and guess I'll have to start over. Next we are on to our armhole. So I have laid the garment out flat like this. We have just finished top stitching the shoulder seams in, and so now if you're going to be sewing your Laura in knit, what we're going to do is fold this seam under by a 1/2 inch and top stitch. That's all you need to do for the armhole. So just iron it in place and top stitch. You could either use your twin needle or you could use your zigzag stitch. If you are using a serger for a woven fabric, what you need to do right now is just serge the entire length of the armhole and then press it under by a 1/2 inch, pin it in place and top stitch. But we are going to be sewing using a regular sewing machine. We are not going to use the serger on this one. So what I'm going to do right now is I am going to turn this over a 1/4 of an inch to the wrong side. I'm going to take this over to my ironing board just to make sure that I've got a precise seam. I'm going to iron this in place. And then I'm going to turn it under another 1/4 of an inch. So that's a double 1/4 inch, making a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now I'm working with my Laura in lightweight cotton, something a bit lighter than a quilting cotton. So if you notice the seam up here, if you have done a French seam on the shoulder seam, when you tuck it under, it may get a little bulky, especially so if you are using heavier weight fabrics like denim or corduroy. It might get a little bit bulky. So what you want to do at this point before you sew this in is you might want to flatten it with a clapper beforehand. Now we have folded it under by a 1/4 of an inch, and I want you to notice this little triangle that's sticking out over here. If I turn it under, you can see over there that there's this little bit that's protruding. Now that's our gauge that we are on the right track. So if you just snip that off at a 1/4 of an inch, when you fold it the next 1/4, it will line up exactly with your side seam. So now you're gonna go ahead and do that for the rest of the other 3 corners. And then I'm just gonna pin this in and we are ready to top stitch. Well, we have finished folding under and pinning the length of the armhole. So right from there to the shoulder seam and then to the next side seam. We're going to just top stitch this with a little bit less than a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. So I am at my sewing machine now and I am going to top stitch this in place just to hold that seam, and then we are done with our arms. So remember to back stitch at either end, and also if you are using a twin needle or if you're using knit fabrics, you're going to be zigzag stitching this in place. This is a woven fabric, so I'm just going to go ahead with a straight top stitching stitch. Now we're going to repeat this process with the other armhole, and then we're done and ready to go on to our neckline.